This video goes with section 97 of Hansen and Quinn's Greek an Intensive course, and it covers temporal clauses, and it's just part one of the whole concept of temporal clauses, which you'll visit again in Unit 19. These temporal clauses are covered in Hansen and Quinn on pages 319 to 322. Temporal clauses are really what they sound like. They're subordinate clauses that tell you about the timing of the main clause. Hansen and Quinn gives you a couple of different conjunctions to work with here. We get epei or epeidae, which means after or since, and we get hote, which means when. And if you think about those two kinds of conjunctions, one is telling you about things that happen prior to the main clause. So if you talk about something that is after something else, the after something else is stuff that happened before, prior to the main clause. And hote lets you talk about things that happen simultaneous with the main clause. So when this is going on, the main clause is happening. So when this is going on, that stuff is happening at the same time as the main clause. So one of the things we'll be thinking about here is the timing of the temporal clause itself, prior or simultaneous action. We've been doing this for a while. I don't know if you remember, but we've had epei for quite a while. And we've had sentences like epei to biblion egrapsen, tous politas edidaxen. After he wrote the book, he taught the citizens. Pretty simple. Right there we've got all indicative, and there was no big deal. You simply translated the after, the epei, and the tenses of the indicative as you saw them. We can also do hote ta biblion egraphen, tous politas edidaxen. When he was writing the book, he taught the citizens. Again, indicative verbs simply translate the conjunction, and the sentence comes out in English meaning the same thing that it does in Greek. Hote ta biblion egrapsen, tous politas edidaxen. When he wrote the book, he taught the citizens. Again, very simple to translate the indicative and then add in the meaning of the conjunctions, and you've got a perfectly good translation of Greek temporal clauses. That's kind of what you already know when you get to section 97 in Hansen and Quinn. And they give you also two new forms, epeidon, after, when, or whenever, and hoton, when or whenever, to use in some other kinds of sentences, some other kinds of clauses. Then they lay out for you a whole chart of temporal clauses that looks a lot like the chart that you got for conditional sentences, because some of the moods and tenses work pretty much the same way that they do in conditional sentences, and I can understand why they want to do that. They want to connect that with something that's already familiar to you. So the indicative sentences that we've just done would fit as past definite, they would call it. They can match present general conditional sentences to temporal clauses, and the same with past general and future more vivid. The only thing is, I don't feel like that's very helpful about what you really have to do when you come across temporal clauses in Greek in the wild, especially since you don't really need to look at the main clause to know what the whole sentence is doing. And part of the reason you have the chart with conditional sentences is to make sure you understand all of the implications. So I want to introduce to you a different way of doing things. Of course, Hansen and Quinn's works, you can look at what they have, and it's all laid out for you in the book. But come with me to a different way of doing things, a different sort of logic. Here, we're going to look at what the conjunction is, and these are the ones we have. And remember, what we've got here is a collection of conjunctions that can do prior, time and simultaneous time for your temporal clause. And then we're going to look at the verb that it introduces, the type of verb that it introduces. We've got indicative that we've been doing. And then we're going to look at the implication of what's in the temporal clause. So if you've got indicative that we've already looked at, the implication of what's in the temporal clause is that you're talking about facts, things that actually happened, factual events. So you can take the conjunction, look at the verb type, and know what's going on in that clause, and then we'll come to how to translate that. You'll also find temporal clauses with the optative, and in those instances, we're looking at general or customary events in the past. And we also get temporal clauses with the subjunctive, where you get general or customary events that are happening in the present or in the future. And these, again, they map onto things that happen with conditional sentences too, but I don't think you need to think about them that way. So what we're going to find is we'll use epei or epede and hote with the indicative. We'll use them with the optative. And when we have subjunctive temporal clauses, we'll use the on forms. And you're used to that with conditional sentences too, with on as the if for those. So let's look and see how those work. We've already done indicative ones where the negative is going to be u. And here are those examples again. And I'm not going to go over them again. Really, all you do is translate the conjunction and the indicative tenses the way that you know them, and you come up with English that represents the Greek very nicely. So let's move on to the optative. Here, the negative of the temporal clause, if you have a negative one, is may. And let's do an example. Epei eis tein nason pemtheie, tous politas edidaxen. The best English way to translate this is, when he was sent to the island, he taught the citizens. The implication there, that's a little harder to bring out in non-clunky English, is that every time after he was sent to the island, he taught the citizens. So it's generally happening, it's customary in the past. After he did that, that's the epei, since that's prior action, he taught the citizens. But I think English most of the time is just going to say, when he was sent to the island, he taught the citizens. Hota ta biblion grapseien, tous politas edidaxen. Whenever she wrote a book, she taught the citizens. Again, we get the implication of general or customary in the past, and this time it's going to be while she's doing it. She taught the citizens. It's simultaneous action. Hota ta biblion graphoi, tous politas edidasken. Whenever she was writing a book, she was teaching the citizens. So you can hear how the English translation is getting across the idea that it usually happened and that it was in the past, and that the things were happening at the same time, that the temporal clause with the hota is getting across the idea of simultaneous action. With the subjunctive, it's going to be the same sort of thing, except it's going to be general or customary events in the present or the future. So, for instance, epeidan eis tein nason pemthei, tous politas didaske. And that's going to be whenever he is sent to the island, he teaches the citizens. Every single time, it's customary, it's generally true in the present. And because it's epeidan, what we're meant to understand is that after he does that, every time after he is sent to the island, he teaches the citizens, which is a little harder to bring out in English, but that's the implication. We can also see the simultaneous action, hotan biblion graphe, tous politas didaske. And here it's simultaneous action. So whenever she writes a book, she teaches the citizens every single time. That's the idea there. Customary action in the present. And similarly, hotan biblion graphe, tous politos didaxe. This is with the future. So we get, whenever she writes a book, she will teach the citizens. So I hope all these examples show you that it's really fairly simple to deal with temporal clauses. And let's look at, again, in a different sort of layout, even simpler, I hope, what's going on here. So we're going to get, this time I'm going to have us look at the conjunction and the verb type and tell you what to do for a translation. We've got our epes and our hotas and the different kinds of verbs that we might do. And if you get epe and the indicative, simply translate after she, whatever the indicative verb is. If you get hota and the indicative, simply translate when she, whatever the indicative is. If you get epe, a form of the epe and the optative, simply translate whenever she verbed. Your idea there is going to be after she verbed, but we don't really do that very well in English when we're talking about general or customary events. Hota, very simple with the optative. You see hota and the optative, translate whenever she verbed. And then you translate the main clause as whatever you see there. It might be indicative, it might be an independent subjunctive, it might be an independent optative. Whatever you see, simply translate the main clause the way that you would if it didn't have a subordinate clause with it, and translate the temporal clause with some of the guidelines here. If we get epedan, that on version of epede, with the subjunctive, then simply translate whenever she verbs. Again, the implication is after whenever she does that, but that's harder to bring out in English. And with hotan, it's quite simple. Hotan and the subjunctive translate whenever she verbs. Now, since we're going a little bit off Hansen and Quinn here, I want to tell you a little bit more. These are the conjunctions that Hansen and Quinn gives you, but these rules I just gave you should work with other temporal conjunctions that you get. So you will find for prior action, for clauses that tell you what happens in the time before the main clause, you'll also see in Greek that you read out in the wild, hos, ex who, from the time when, or is what that means more literally. So since, ever since, and af who, which will mean since or ever since. And for simultaneous action, you'll see henika, haos, mechri, hoson chronon, and enho. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are ones that you might run into. And these rules for translating temporal clauses should work the same way, especially since you can add on to any of those to do the subjunctive kind of temporal clauses. So there you have it. Part 1 of temporal clauses to go with Hansen and Quinn's section 97, but explaining things in a way that's a bit different from Hansen and Quinn. You will end up learning about part 2 with some other kinds of temporal clauses that aren't addressed here with section 144 and 145 and the video for that.